Hi, Halima. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We'll just take maybe 20 more seconds before we get started. Thanks for joining. Happy International Day of Girls in ICT. Okay. Well, it's 8:01. I think I'm just going to go ahead and get started if that's okay with everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I know that there are people here from all over, which is great to see. Thanks for joining. My name is Tiffany Sprague. I'm co-founder at Scientific Adventures for Girls. I will be the moderator for this conversation today as we celebrate International Day of Girls in Information and Communication Technology, or ICT for short, day. And this day was established by the UN agency, the International Telecommunication Union, and is celebrated around the world, acknowledging girls and young women and encouraging them to pursue studies and careers in the technology sector through training and coding, mobile app development, IT, all kinds of fun jobs that are in emerging demand. So access and safety was selected as this year's theme as part of the first steps for girls to be able to access the digital environment in a safe way. Especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, children are spending more time online than ever before. And they're starting at a young age. Growing up online offers boundless opportunities. Through computers, smartphones, gaming systems, TVs, children learn, imagine, and develop their social networks. When it's used in the right way and accessible to all, the internet has the potential to broaden perspectives and possibilities and spark creativity and innovation. And if you remember the young woman, Gitanjali Rao, she's Time's first ever Kid of the Year in 2020. She was just 15 years old, and she used technology to tackle issues that really meant a lot to her, like contaminated drinking water and opioid addiction. But with these opportunities comes really serious risks. UN Women has reported a global rise in the online harassment of women and girls since the start of the pandemic. So more time spent online for school, career, and socializing. It's provided more time for bullies and trolls to target, harass, and intimidate. So before we really launch into the discussion, I want to poll the audience here today. What percentage of young people between the ages of 12 and 17 do you think have been bullied online? And I'll give you about 30 seconds to put in your answers. Okay, what do we have here? If you can launch the answers, that would be what we have. That's so actually, so the answer is 37%. And girls are 3 times as likely to experience cyberbullying. So I'll say that again, girls are actually 3 times as more likely to experience cyberbullying and other forms of peer-to-peer, which can affect young people each time they log into social media or instant messaging platforms. When browsing the internet, children may be exposed to hate speech and violent content. Oh, here we go. So actually more, people thought more. It's actually, yeah, 37. And it's growing since the pandemic. That's good. Yeah, so such threats, attacks, limit girls' freedom of expression. Driving girls out of online spaces is extremely disempowering in this digital world and impacts their ability to be seen, heard, and become leaders. If women and girls are unable to access the internet and feel safe online, this puts at risk their ability to develop digital skills and engage on digital platforms. And then this just decreases their opportunities to pursue careers in STEM fields, which is why we're all here today. So as you know, Scientific Adventures for Girls, or how we call it lovingly SAfG, our mission is to close the gender gap in STEM, as they are still massively underrepresented in STEM fields, especially computer science. So I don't know if you know, but according to the Caper Center, only 29% of students in the state of California actually take introductory computer science classes, girls. And only 36 Black girls and 453 Latinx girls took the AP computer science in California. And that's just in 1 year. And only 20% of computer scientists in the US are women. And the percentage gets smaller and smaller as you look at management and boardrooms. So we believe at SAfG that gender equality in STEM will achieve many goals simultaneously: better education, gender equality, women's economic empowerment. And so we're trying to do this by providing engaging STEM programs for young girls, showing them that STEM has no gender. So there are numerous barriers that we can talk about to women and girls pursuing STEM today, but today we're here to discuss how we can all collaborate as a STEM ecosystem, as a community here in the East Bay, to overcome access and safety barriers that girls face when they engage with more digital platforms, because we can't solve this issue in our silos. We need to work together, parents, educators, corporations, governments, to ensure that we intentionally build safe and equitable digital spaces for everyone to thrive. So I am super excited to have with us today 3 gender equality champions and advocates in this space. They have each made amazing strides that they will share with us today. Today here we have Halima Barucha. She's an Olympic weightlifter, facilitator, and change maker. She leads equity-focused workshops to equip people with tools to make change on topics including bystander intervention, community safety, Islamophobia, racial equity, professional development, and gender justice. And she's trained over 700 people. She's a very busy woman. She is passionate about curating digital content and brands for social justice. Previously, Halima worked at the Greenlining Institute to tackle tech equity, including the digital divide, algorithmic racial bias, and net neutrality. She brings to this discussion here her analysis on gender equity in all areas of her work. Maren Hunsberger, she is a microbiologist and your personal science explainer, having earned her BS in biology and environmental science and then her master's in science communication. She now creates videos about why the world works the way it does and how you encounter science in your everyday life. You can find her asking questions about science all over the internet. She's on the Seeker podcast. Go look it up. And creating videos for clients like Lawrence Livermore Lab on her personal YouTube channel and on her social media channels. And then finally, we have Jamie Nunez. He is the Western Regional Manager at Common Sense. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Common Sense. I know I use it as a parent to look up the ratings for movies and TV shows. He supports state education agencies, school districts, and parents across the Western region of the US in their efforts to implement digital literacy initiatives. For nearly 20 years, Jamie has redefined tech use in schools by incorporating students' digital lives in the classroom. And he's been a high school teacher, vice principal, and after-school director. He's trained thousands of educators and parents on how to leverage student learning in digital spaces, and he has a 7-year-old. And when he's not working, he can be found in the ocean teaching her how to swim. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our panel today. Just a bit of logistical details. We prepared questions for each of our panelists. It's going to be kind of a round robin, casual discussion, and then we reserved a bit of time at the end for questions from you. Please, though, use the chat function or the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen. You can feel free to put in any of your thoughts, comments, questions along the way. And we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Okay, so I am done talking, setting the scene, setting the context. I'm ready to jump in. So first, I want to ask our panelists to share with us what they think are the biggest priorities in making digital spaces safe for youth, especially girls starting at a young age in particular, and what you have done. How does this manifest in your work and what your company has done to address these issues? I'd like to start with Jamie, please.
First of all, thank you very much, folks that are on the call. I really appreciate the space. Tiffany, thank you very much. The work that you all are doing is critical, and just I can't thank you enough. I mean, both as a parent to a daughter that's learning skills and how to integrate her own identity online, to simply addressing very intense mental health issues for young women around the world. So let me kind of provide some context for what we do at Common Sense. For those of you that don't know who we are and what we are essentially the leading nonprofit, and our aim is to address digital citizenship, media literacy skills, ensure that our kids are safe, secure, and thinking critically about the spaces they're in online. We do that in a number of ways. We provide ratings and reviews for parents around the world. For educators, our 1.5 million educators that use our site every day, we provide a free curriculum to use in school, addressing some of these issues, anything ranging from cyberbullying to privacy concerns. And then finally, we have a policy arm that helps address and helps to push legislation to ensure that issues like broadband access or issues around technology are actually at the forefront of what legislators are doing. So in many ways, we're kind of encompassing that. And if I were to kind of share at this point what's happening and where I feel there's the greatest needs, what I would probably suggest, or what I'd probably think about or invite you all to consider is, number one, how issues around being online are very complex for our kids. In many ways, when we think about removing technology or getting access to technology, many of our young girls and our young women, they're really grappling with a number of issues around their perception, their identity online, how to actually navigate spaces online. And many of these issues for families or even educators, they're really, there's not a sort of one way to solve that, right? We want to kind of ensure and empathize with the fact that our younger girls are really grappling with the complexities of being online. So one is just the idea of empathy and understanding the complexities of some of these issues that we're going to be addressing. The second, I believe, and I think there's an invitation here, there's a challenge for us all, is to think about how we can use digital citizenship, not to provide parameters for our kids, but to ensure that we highlight and reinforce their contributions that they actually make online. So I'm so blessed to be on a call with Maren and Halima, because there's an identity and there's a perception that are well known about what they're doing online. For many of our young girls, there isn't that identity. There's not those role models that are seen at the forefront. So being able to highlight and amplify and continuously, excuse me, share out the positive contributions that these young kids are making in their everyday lives and young girls are making is another one. And I think the final piece, if I were to kind of share the need for this, is the need for our adults in our lives to provide access to and thinking routines and habits that can help young girls navigate some of these issues. And that is essentially ranging from, are we teaching our kids to move beyond just cyberbullying, our girls to move beyond cyberbullying, and to think about how they're going to be navigating what resilience looks like for them? Excuse me. Are we addressing ways in which they can protect their own information online? Are we providing not only the space, but those habits? So when we're not there, the adults are not there. When we're not monitoring things that our kids are doing online, our girls are doing online, can we ensure that they've built those sort of internal habits and what we refer to at Common Sense as thinking routines? Have we done that? Can we do that? Are we providing the spaces to do that? So I can go on and on, but as you all know, I kind of get excited and sweaty when I think about these topics. But that's what I'll refrain from speaking more.
Thanks, Jamie. Halima, do you have any reactions to that? Responses? You can also jump in with what you think are the biggest priorities. Do you agree with Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many priorities, I think, when it comes to the digital space. We're thinking about things from like censorship to cyber flashing. So there's a lot going on. And I think during this, the COVID-19 crisis in particular, we have started spending a lot more time online, and a lot more of us are being in these digital spaces as a way of connecting with people, as a way of understanding more about our identities, being in groups that reflect kind of our values. So it's starting to become almost a lifeline. And if you think of issues like the digital divide, there is still a lot of people who are left out of these spaces. Or if you think of how censorship or shadow banning or doxing, you know, all of these things still continue to target. So to me, it's always like a double-edged sword where there's like a both and, right? There's some really incredible and positive impacts that social media and the digital space can have, and just access to digital platforms. And then there's also the flip side of it, where there is an overexposure to things like rape culture, cyberbullying, damaging thoughts about self-image, cyber flashing. So there's a lot going on, and I think it's really important for us to find that balance in how do we create boundaries and create healthy relationships with the digital space, and how do we engage with that in a meaningful way, and also recognize that this isn't like the end-all be-all. I think one really good example is, seeing the way that Twitter got bought out, right? Like it is showing us that a lot of these platforms, they're not owned by us and they're not meant necessarily for us, and they can be censored, shut down at any time, or there could be a paywall at any time. And so it really does put us into a place of thinking, what does sustainable and healthy social media and online digital engagement, digital citizenship look like, and how do we create platforms that are by us, for us? And I think it's really exciting to see so many young women, girls, gender nonconforming people, trans people in STEM who are starting to do innovation and creating these spaces for ourselves. One organization that I'm really inspired by is She Electricity. And it's an organization that specifically put together a digital platform just for girls of color to have their own space, and to know that that would be kind of a safe and affirming space. So I think it's exciting to see initiatives like that popping up, and for us to really take ownership of our own digital presence.
Thanks, Halima, for that. I wanted to see if you can give some definitions actually for our audience. We had some questions come in advance, and you were talking about some of the risks that people face online, like doxing and grooming and cyberbullying. One person had a question about what spoofing and phishing are. I don't know if you'd like to take that on and maybe explain what doxing is for some people that might not.
Yeah, so doxing is something that has become more, it's basically when your information is publicly revealed, like something that is meant to be private, personal information, like your home address. And doxing is something that a lot of social media, like activists, have been dealing with on social media. So their personal information kind of being put out there, and then they become targeted, and people use that information to target them. And then cyber flashing is essentially like sending unsolicited sexual content without consent. So one example would be like, one time I was actually at a boba shop and somebody airdropped dick pics to everyone and other sexually inappropriate content. And that was obviously without consent or permission, but because airdrop was open, to anyone, they kind of just sent it out. And so that was pretty problematic. And now you do see companies starting to do things where, like, if somebody sends you a DM with a picture, it's blurred and you can tap to unblur. So there's like some level of consent or like protection and like layers that are being added on. But it's essentially when you get sent that kind of information without consent or permission.
Okay. Thanks so much.
And Tiffany, spoofing, I think you had asked as well. It's really often, it's a century sort of old kind of form of trickery, but as it refers to it online, it's essentially any time a scammer disguises their own identity as another. In general, that's called spoofing. So for example, if you ever receive a call and it's from, it doesn't say scammer on your caller ID, it says like someone else's name or particular location, that would be a sort of a form of trickery. That would be a spoof that you would sort of be connected to, or a caller ID spoof.
Got it. Thank you. I mean, this is important, like to arm ourselves with these definitions of these. I mean, there's new ways coming up every day. So that's, this is great that we're engaging in this conversation, especially parents of young ones. And Maren, as a woman in STEM and someone that's in this space, that works in this space, you have a very public persona as well. It'd be really great to hear your perspective on what you think are the biggest priorities in making spaces safe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have a little bit of a different perspective as someone who is a power user of social media to promote women and non-binary people in STEM, specifically ICT, because I did my most recent master's degree in medical bioinformatics from microbiology. So I'm really passionate about getting women and girls and non-binary folks into ICT. And I experience harassment for being a visible woman in STEM, just for existing online all the time. And it really is a huge barrier. It's a huge barrier to wanting to women and girls wanting to put themselves in those positions, because the feeling is like, why would I make my life harder if these spaces aren't safe for me? So I think what Halima is mentioning is those spaces that are popping up, that are meant for people like us who are interested in those topics, that are, safe spaces that are created specifically for that, are so important. But we also know that our kids, I'm not personally a parent, but we know that our young kids, and especially teenagers, are going to be on social media before the pandemic, but definitely during the pandemic. And Halima spoke to this. It was their social life. Their entire social life is online. And I think as educators, as mentors, and as parents, we need to make sure that we take that really seriously and make sure that you are a safe space and a safe person for your child to talk to you about that, and take it really seriously. So when they mention off the cuff, offhand, casually drop mentions of their online social life, not dismissing it as something that's not real or something that doesn't count as much because it's not in person. That is so important. It is where their life lives, is online. So making sure that even if you don't feel like you know exactly what's going on all the time when they talk to you about the different terms, the different communities, making sure they know you're listening, and they know that you will respond empathetically if they bring up a problem. Because I think that's the most important thing we can do as adults in these situations, is to make a place for teenagers and young girls to feel like they can bring problems to us, and we will be able to figure it out together. Because the internet can also be incredibly isolating in the same way that it is incredibly connecting, and people can feel like, oh my God, I'm the only one who this has ever happened to, and it can make you feel silly or ashamed. So just like with any other piece of education that may feel a little more taboo or a little more high stakes, making sure that we take the shame out of it and make sure that there's lots of empathy so that children can feel like they can talk really openly about their experiences and don't feel like they have to hide things from their parents and their educators.
Yeah, spot on. And Maren, there is a follow-on question, actually. Maybe it makes sense to ask it now. This came from one of our participants. How can parents monitor girls' online use without looking over their shoulders? I don't know if you have any tips around that.
That's a tough one. Again, as myself not being a parent, I don't feel like I'm in a position to offer any concrete advice. I'm definitely not going to name drop any apps or pieces of software, because I've never been in the position of needing to monitor that. But for me personally, as someone who was a teenager not that long ago, I do feel that if you put in place, there are certain softwares, there are certain, bottlenecks that you can implement with your service provider to block access to certain sites. To me, that feels a little bit too much like censorship and too much like, oh, we're never going to talk about what this is, this doesn't exist. And then when your teenager goes to college or goes out into the world, where there is access to sites like that, they won't know how to deal with it. So I think being as open and transparent as possible about everything that's out there, the good, the bad, and the ugly, making sure you're really upfront, having open conversations with your teenagers, especially about everything that is possible on the internet, which includes a lot of scary stuff, making sure that they have that toolkit of language and coping strategies to say, if this happens, you can come and talk to me about it and you won't be in trouble. I think that is miles more effective than putting in place what is essentially like spyware for your own children. I think there are a lot of tools and apps, and maybe Jamie can speak to this, that would let you have a little bit more parental control, especially for younger children. But I think when it comes to teenagers, we really need to be prepping them for the real world and knowing how to handle themselves and keep themselves safe when they will inevitably be exposed to those places on the internet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, and something I'll add to that is there are ways of, what I call digital self-defense, just as we think of protecting ourselves from like sexual harassment or street harassment in real life, in person. There are ways that we can use some of the resources in an online setting. And there's a lot of young women and girls in STEM who are creating their own apps and coding and different protective layers, right? There are ways to say, okay, if I need help, I can leverage the technology to be able to get help. There's an app, for example, called Circle of Six that you can use to notify like your immediate emergency contacts. And I like it because unlike the emergency like built-in features on most phones, it doesn't necessarily call the police right away. It calls the people that you want to be called. And for me, that's important because I'm not comfortable calling the police in most cases. And for a lot of people of color and Black folks in particular, that's not a scenario that will make us safer. So, you know, if I were walking somewhere and something were to happen, I need help, I can use my phone in that way. But also being able to add in these protective layers in terms of, you know, using the blur feature, going on Instagram, and there's ways that you can filter out like certain words. So if you don't want to see certain words, you know, commented on your feed, things like that, you can just blur that out. So there's ways to kind of filter through the digital space, and I think that is important in keeping your mental health. I have been harassed, you know, more times than I can count online on social media by many trolls, and they just, you know, they come out of the woodworks and have lots of things to say, and it can be very easy to like fall into that. But at the end of the day, these are strangers who know nothing about me and have no right to give an opinion about, you know, what I should be wearing or how I should live my life or what I should say or not do. But when your whole world or when a big part of your world is digital, it can be very easy for those comments or for those things to matter. So I have found, you know, just using some of the existing tools and built-in safety features and security features that are built into apps or, you know, adding in new apps has been really helpful. So I don't even have to spend like time, energy, or mental capacity to say like, let me delete these messages or, you know, respond to it or even have to read it in the first place, because it's not helpful to me and it's not adding anything to my life.
Absolutely. And I just want to add on to that quickly, Tiffany, that in addition to those excellent tools that are built into the platforms now that are getting better, of like filtering out certain keywords that you don't want to see or blocking certain users, I think something that we can do as educators with very limited resources, right, and as parents as well, who may not be as familiar with as many of the in platform tools or extra apps, is we can talk to our girls and young women about the base sort of almost basically what Halima was saying, street smarts, but for the digital world. Like, I never post anything about where I am currently, like my physical location, until maybe 2 days after the fact. If I want to post like, oh, Brussels, that was so nice. I do it when I'm not there. And that's something really basic that we as educators and as parents and can then pass on to our young girls who are maybe coming into this space for the first time, saying, you know, very basic, yeah, street smarts, self-defense for making sure that you can't be doxxed, you can't be found, people can't track your internet presence to you in real life.
Yeah, that's a great segue to my second question, actually, is that we all know that digitalization opens up a lot of opportunities, as you all are examples of this, right? But however, it does open up a world of abuse, misinformation, misogyny, which disempowers girls every day. As we spend more time online in our lives, how early do you think digital literacy competency should be actually introduced at school? Like, what is the role of school? Yeah, I mean, parents for sure. I mean, we similar to just, you know, being social beings at school. We have a responsibility as parents at home, but educators, and what is digital literacy looking like in elementary schools? Do you think it should start at a young age? Is this actually happening in the state of California from your perspective? And, you know, SAfG, that's our whole thing, is starting with early learners as early as age 5. You know, so I'll back up digital literacy. There's a lot of definitions, working definitions about digital literacy and digital hygiene or digital safety. But what we've been working off of is the ability to access, manage, understand, integrate, communicate, evaluate, and create information safely and appropriately through digital technologies for employment, decent jobs, and entrepreneurship. So is this already being standardized in elementary school? Do you think that it should be as early as 5 years old, kindergarten? When should we start? And what would it take for schools to adopt a gender responsive curricula? What do you think this looks like for you? And Jamie, I kind of want to start with you, and as an educator, and you were a principal before and worked with the administration and government. What are your reactions to this question?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I do want to make sure that I add something on the chat for in relationship to the parental control questions. If you are curious about it as families or folks on the call, feel free to go through that article. I think it highlights, I believe, what both Maren and Halima just mentioned a second ago. as well as provides families some resources. So I think when we think about digital literacy skills and embedding some of these skills into the classroom, I think what's really important to kind of know is the trajectory of when the child first receives a device to the time the child has built up enough agency. And as we think about girls and incorporating these things, one of the things we want to really ensure is that that mental health component is consistent. That, you know, in schools it's often referred to as social or emotional learning, but whatever we provide for our young girls and women in these spaces, they should go hand in hand. Obviously for all students, but in particular for the conversation that we're having, because these platforms tend to impact. We know young girls when they're on Instagram and so on and so forth, right? Frances Haugen's like kind of response recently around the impact that Instagram was having on girls. So let me take a step back and kind of provide a narrative about what I see in schools that I think are really amazing. So some of the work, for example, coming out here in the Bay Area with Oakland Unified School District, I think a lot can be shared about what it actually means to put computers and tech in the hands of students. But one of the things that I really appreciated, and one of the ways that perhaps parents or policymakers can really model after, is the work that came out of Oakland. And we know that both Oakland Unified, and again, folks that are on the call that know the intricacies of this can certainly chime in on the chat. But we know that first and foremost, our young girls need access to technology that is helpful. We need to kind of reach the most vulnerable students, all students, but all our girls that don't have that access. And what happened in Oakland, and what I really appreciate, is that city initiatives, city funding, the school district partnered together to provide technology, tech laptops, resources for all students. And I think we need to kind of start there, right? So when and how access is handed out, what does broadband access look like? I may have access to a Chromebook, but if I don't have enough internet and the speed of an internet to actually participate in some of these sort of like very high processing kind of apps, then it becomes really daunting, right? That there's barriers to entry right away. So I really want to start there, which is like being able to ensure that schools not only have one-to-one devices, but that there's a proper understanding and an acknowledgement that with that comes a responsibility and a connection to connect on, right? The other thing I think where is access, and I think what the state of California is doing very well in is ensuring that digital literacy skills is not just a one-off initiative, that it's a whole sort of what we refer to common sense as a whole community approach, which basically means that if I'm a math teacher or a science teacher, I'm embedding some of these skills within my students. If I'm a first grade teacher teaching about literacy, that I should be teaching the work that both again Marina and Helena had mentioned. So we need to sort of have tentacles, and we need to ensure that not only it's across a curriculum, but we need to ensure that families are invested in the understanding of what literacy skills mean for young girls and how to model for them at home. So being able to work with parent coordinators and embedding some of these skills and practices there. And then for teachers to feel equipped, to not feel like they're just regurgitating parameters and rules. You know, when I speak with schools or speak with school districts or even school district administrators, they say, Jamie, we just need a one-stop shop where we can teach these lessons and then move on because we have competing interests or competing initiatives that are happening. And I want to value that. To put the entire onus on schools or school districts, it's really, really difficult to do that without understanding the nuances that happen in how school districts run. So I think as parents, the charge is to ensure, if you're speaking to your teacher or speaking to your school administrator, to say, number one, does my child have access to literacy skills when you teach technology, when you provide that app at home? If not, then I don't want my child to be embedded into the nuances of what's going to happen in that platform. Like that agency is really powerful and very easy to do. Two is take inventory as a parent. What are the apps my child is on, and what information are they collecting about my child that I need to be aware of, right? I love Helena's earlier point about like if my school is oversharing to a third party what that information is doing for my child or their usage on X app, that's a problem, right? We want to be mindful. The problem is not the information, but the problem is that the blind kind of approach to technology that we need to be aware. And I think the final thing is really just there needs to be a scope and sequence along the way. So as I started, when the child first creates, or when a girl first receives that technology, being mindful that what literacy skills look like is going to be about how we connect with one another, how we connect with the device. By the time the child is in 3rd to 5th grade, there's more engagement on social media platforms. We know our kids are like on Minecraft or Roblox, so we need to teach them how to navigate relationships online. And then when they get to middle school and high school, that the curriculum or the connections or the themes should really focus on agency. Now that you have a power to contribute, we know that you're on these platforms despite the fact that it's like 13 up. Here's what you can do about it. Here's the things that you could prepare for now, given the fact that you're going to be confronted with a number of these issues, right? So sorry to be so long-winded again, but I think it's a great question, but we have to kind of understand sort of the nuances of all these experiences.
For sure. I mean, it's definitely complicated, and it's a very fluid process, like how we're engaging with digital, and it's very fast. So I'm just wondering how schools are monitoring that, how districts are taking that into account when they're, looking at education reform and how they prioritize digital.
Yeah, I will quickly say that there's the state here in California, there's quite a bit of initiatives being shared out. I know Common Sense is trying to push a digital citizenship and literacy kind of initiative where all schools would be mandated to teach a digital citizenship course. So that's, we're working on that bill to pass here in California. And I know that's often taught through media literacy skills or computer science skills, but again, this needs to be all encompassing. So,
yeah. Helena, what are your thoughts on how young we should start teaching digital?
I mean, I'm seeing babies as young as a few months old, right, holding onto a phone and watching Coco Melon, or there's a very, very early age in which youth are interacting with technology. And in terms of how schools can tackle that, or how that's being integrated, it's very disparate and disproportionate because of the way our schools are funded, district by district, based on property taxes, which perpetuates a lot of different biases. I won't get into all that, but the point being, you can have one school a few miles away with the best technology teaching these kids coding. I learned C++ when I was in 9th grade, and you can have kids who are using textbooks that are like 20 years older than them, right? And those are realities of what is available in terms of funding. I do think at, elementary school, high school at the latest, all students need to understand how to do basic coding, because it is starting to become such a crucial part of skills that you need in the workplace and in the job space. But in terms of like digital literacy, that needs to start at a very early age. Do I think that's realistic or feasible? It's going to happen anytime soon? No, I don't think so. I think when you look at even just generally sexual harassment in schools, gender responsive resources, culturally responsive programming in schools, it's very limited, and schools are in person dealing with sexual harassment, let alone the online space. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen. There's a lot of legislation and action that needs to happen there, and funding that needs to be streamlined. Right now, California has a budget surplus, once again, which is very exciting. And it's an opportunity, right, to be able to spend some of that money on digital infrastructure, on closing the gaps in the digital divide, on making sure that there's funding for organizations to actually provide these services. A lot of organizations in the nonprofit sector are really behind on understanding the role of technology and how to properly integrate that into curriculum, again, in part because of the lack of resources and information available. So it really just comes down to resources, right? Do we have the resources to do it? But I think from day one, everyone needs to have some core competencies around digital literacy, around how to safely navigate the internet. And especially for really young kids, I do worry because, if you're watching something, on your phone, there's ads that pop up, there's things that pop up, and you may not even know what you're clicking. And so there's a huge lack of consent in the online space in terms of data collection. And, there's a lot of things that we just click accept, the terms and agreements. And, there's a lot of surveillance that happens. So I do worry about what that means for like really, really young kids who may not even be able to like properly read or write, but they're still, on a phone. And that's just the nature of, I think, living in this, time period and this moment in time, like everything is online. And, yeah. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to happen, and there are, bills and like Jamie mentioned, initiatives and efforts that are happening to try to help close these gaps. And it's hard to keep up too, because technology grows exponentially, and as communities and as people, we grow like more linearly, and it's not like an exponential growth level. So it's hard to keep up, as well for that reason. But I think there's a lot of good effort and momentum, and organizations like yours, obviously, that are holding these conversations, that are coming at it from a gender responsive lens, right? That are really thinking about it critically, and I think that's so important to start that conversation and the work.
Thank you, Halima. Maren, any reactions or any thoughts to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I absolutely love the responses from Jamie and Halima and completely agree. And just to bring a little bit of a different perspective, both of my parents have been public school educators for decades. And so I'm always loath to ask teachers to do more because they don't get paid enough to do that. But my mom has been teaching in Nevada, which is the falls 50th in terms of public school education funding. And they had an interesting, she teaches language, foreign language, and she ended up teaching most of her classes were actually life skills. They just had a bunch of classes every day that were life skills. And it was everything from balancing a checkbook to dressing for a job interview. And I think I'd never heard her talk about anything in the digital space in the life skills class. So to speak to both Jamie and Halima's points, I think we need to really recognize that the digital world is an integrated part of the fabric of our children's reality now, and that needs to be a core part of any conversation that we're having around basic life skills. And that includes things like knowing that Facebook is the internet. I've spoken to so many young people who have just been using Facebook from the very first time they turned on a computer and don't recognize that they are on the internet when they're on Facebook. So me as a scientific educator, I'm really interested in introducing the whole concept of the internet, right? When I turned 13 when we got our first home computer. So I'm sort of right on the edge of like understanding that the internet is this new thing. Whereas kids now are growing up with it just everywhere all the time, like Halima was saying, on their phone, on their iPad, in their face from day one. So I'm interested in creating resources as a scientific educator that teachers can then use in classrooms, like life skills classes, like health classes, right? Where we talk about physical health, mental health. We need to be talking about digital health and how that plays into it. I want to create resources that say, this is what the internet is. Like physically, bits and bytes inside your device. This is what your data is. What do we mean when we say your data? Who is collecting it and what is it? Where is it going, right? Introducing those concepts from a very basic standpoint of questions that people may not even know that they have, and then being like, okay, now we can have a really critical conversation around what we want to do in this space and think a little bit more about it, as opposed to just logging onto the computer, getting on Facebook, and then being like, oh, why did my phone use data? I was just on Facebook. It's because you were using the internet. So that's just a little bit of sprinkled in thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, all great responses. Sorry, I'm just looking at the time. Wow, I knew that the hour would go by really fast. I have one more question that really does speak to what you guys were talking about, and it's just lack of resources. But there are resources out there, right? I mean, we know that one person can buy Twitter in one go, just like that. But we are all an ecosystem, and I think there is a lot of awareness now and a lot of attention to this collective impact. How can we make impact working together, like Oakland Undivided? And I think we have some folks from Oakland Undivided we're a partner of, who are really working with private sector, the public schools and organizations like ours to really move the needle on digital equity. And so my question is, how can we all work together to prevent this and promote digital safety? There are a lot of competing issues right now, but I feel like, and I know SAfG as an organization really, this is a high priority for us, as we educate our girls in the after school space in formal education, like how can we get everyone on board, work together? What have you been doing practically to work and engage with other stakeholders in our ecosystem? What has worked? What are your challenges? And what are some opportunities for cross-sectoral collaboration to make changes? It takes time, but I feel like to get ahead of this situation so that people aren't left behind? I mean, already women and girls are being impacted by COVID. Like, what can we do right now to engage with one another? Yeah, maybe we'll just go back to Jamie to start.
I tend to go practical mostly because at the end of the day, I have like a 7-year-old and I have to acknowledge that what I'm saying every day to school leaders, I have to then model as a parent.
Yeah.
And I have to humble myself with the fact that I don't know, like looking at Helena's comment just a second ago, like sometimes there's so many things that pop up. So I'd say the first thing to do is to have some patience, like have like be able to recognize that you might make mistake if you're a parent, or you might actually not know everything, and that's okay, right? That co-viewing, co-understanding, co-interpreting sort of the digital world is perfectly okay to do. I think in terms of collaborating, what I think agencies and organizations and school leaders really need to know and consider is ways in which they can. I'm trying to kind of frame this in a way that can be extremely applicable and practical. Um, Ways that they themselves want to model the type of experiences that they want to use, right? Sometimes I'm on calls and you can clearly tell people are really tired, like they're visually really tired from being on a Zoom call. And we have to kind of teach some of these skills as adults, and we have to sort of model what it is in our own professional lives. So I'd say the sort of first thing is to kind of take inventory of the ways in which we're modeling proper behavior for our kids and for our girls online. This is what it means like to have balance when we're on a Zoom call. This is what it means. This is why I posted this on YouTube, and this is the reason before that. Girls need to see models, and they need to understand the process and how much curation it takes to create something. So that's one. And then I think for agencies, specifically in empowering young girls, especially on a day like today, is to recognize, and I started with this, and I think I want to close off this, is like, as an agency, understand where you're already doing something very well at and highlight the progress of those initiatives as much as you can. Not to be egotistical, not to kind of do that for selfish reasons or to build additional funding, but to simply say, we want to partner with you. This is where we're really good at. These are our strengths. And this is where we need some support around this initiative. We don't need to kind of overcomplicate some of these big, large themes. We just sort of need to focus on maybe one or two. If we're going to address cybersecurity or cyberbullying issues, what does that look like? What does access look like, right? So just really get at the minutia and start with those small initiatives, highlight those strengths, and to, again, have empathy for oneself, or just, be forgiving, because we're still kind of learning in this process. So I know that's a little sort of nebulous, but those are kind of things that I'm thinking about at the moment.
No, I mean, it's understanding the root cause, and yeah, just having this really zooming out and looking at what we're
Absolutely
dealing with before delving in. Yeah. Thanks for that. Halima, I know you have experience and success in working with the government. I was just listening to your an interview with KQED, which the BART initiative that you were part of. I can't remember the name of it exactly, but just in really advocating and succeeding in addressing social issues like being harassed on BART and whatnot. Like, yeah, it was an amazing interview, and I just wondered if you can speak to your experience with, working with BART or working with the government to put these into place. Like, is it? Yeah.
I think it's critical that our governments recognize the role of technology in facilitating gender-based violence and sexual harassment. And when we make that connection very explicit, that technology is not like its own thing in a vacuum. There's a lot of different factors that come into play, and our government does have a responsibility to tackle this through policy solutions. Technology still is like one of the most unregulated spaces because of how fast and quickly it grows. So there's a lot of things that it can do without having a lot of transparency or regulations. There is a bill right now that is, it's called SB 53. It's the Flash Act. And the focus of it is to forbid lewd activity and sexual harassment online. And it would protect technology users when they receive unsolicited, sexually explicit images and videos, and would make this a punishable offense that could actually be fined. So it's important to, support legislation like that makes this connection very explicit and starts to call out these issues, just as if someone would flash me in real life, that is an offense that is punishable, that is wrong, that we've all, as a society, agreed is not okay. We need to also make that same stance when it comes to the digital space. I think the second thing is we need to work with girls and gender-expansive youth from an early age. They are interacting with technology, they're fluent in technology, and they have the solutions that they need to address these issues that they're experiencing. And we need to trust them with that, and we need to empower them with that. I know when youth are given the resources and support, they can do incredible work, just like we saw with the Not One More Girl initiative at BART, where youth were given the resources and support to be able to drive their solutions and make them happen. And so that might look like platforms bias for us, and I think that's what one of the things that I've been thinking about is seeing what's happening with Twitter and just even with Meta, like all the different platforms. It is time for us to create a platform by the people for the people, where we can really have spaces to talk about the issues that matter to us and drive social change. I think as Maren said, the digital space can be used for a lot of great things. And I know I've definitely used my platform to be able to highlight important issues around gender-based violence, to mobilize people to show up, when it comes to call to actions. So I want to be able to think more of like, how do we create spaces for us to continue to use that, but in a way that feels safe and good for us? And as Jamie was saying, like also modeling that, right? Sometimes it's okay to have your camera off in a Zoom meeting, or, sometimes it's okay to say, I'm going to set my limit for screen time at this hour, or I don't need to read through this comment or watch this video that's going to be hurtful. And sometimes we get desensitized to all the content that comes our way. So I think it's, those three things. One is, our government's taking action through policy solutions. The second thing is us really centering girls and gender-expansive youth in this work. How do we bring them on in paid capacities, right, to work with us as consultants, as designers, as strategists, all the different things that they bring, the talents that they bring into these spaces. And finally, modeling and really having platforms that are biased for us. So those are my three things.
Amazing. Thank you, Halima. And Maren, any thoughts on that?
Absolutely, yeah. As someone who's not coming from within an institution, I can really just speak to the personal, individual, day-to-day, one-to-one interactions that I think are really impactful. And I'm going to repeat and build on things that Jamie and Halima have already said. But I think that those pillars are primarily empowerment. So by that I mean, yes, the platforms are imperfect, but if you are going to be on it, making sure that everyone who is on it knows that they can control some aspects of their experience. So say, for instance, if things that are coming up on your feed are really impacting your day-to-day in a negative way, knowing that you can change that. You can curate your own experience to some extent, and knowing that you have the power to do that, you can do that, and you should do that if you need to, is in a really important conversation. Second, I think harm reduction is incredibly important, and that includes really comprehensive education. Like Halima is saying, sexual assault and sexual harassment are things that can happen digitally as well. And we talk about those things in sex ed, ideally, not in all states, unfortunately, but it's something that we really need to talk about comprehensively and openly and transparently in school, and hopefully as families as well, that we are not going to shy away from talking about things like porn and the effect that they have on teenagers, especially. I'm speaking about, like, we need to be having very open and transparent conversations around everything that someone might encounter on the internet, so that when they do encounter it, they know how to handle it and they know how to talk to you about it, and they know that they can talk to you about it. And then thirdly, I think the most important thing is reaching out and building a community. So using those tools, like Halima was saying, in a positive way. So if you yourself are interested in bugs in the Atacama Desert, and you're like, I have no one in my life who is talking about bugs in the Atacama Desert, there are 5 people online who are talking about it. I want to talk to you about it specifically. So knowing that you can use the internet as a resource in that way to build your own communities. And as Halima is saying again, maybe even learning how to build your own platform for that in case the platform itself isn't serving you in the way that you hoped it would. So I think those are my main, very basic things that we can do today as individuals, talking to each other about it, making sure that everyone feels like you can talk about it safe and openly, so that we can all better our experiences.
Thank you. Yes, that's right. We have 5 minutes. I did want to see if anyone put any other questions in the chat, just to give give the audience here a chance to say things. We were in such great conversation. Anyone? I think I've asked all the questions that were shared. Okay. Great. Well, if you think of any other questions after this, you can always feel free to email us at SAfG. This is recorded and will be living on our website. We'll be sharing it with you so you can have it. Oh, good, thanks. Yeah, and if panelists, if you want people to reach out to you, please feel free to put it in the chat for
Oh,
everybody.
Tiffany, I had that one last thing that I was going to say.
Yeah, go for it.
It was like, especially for when we're talking about unifying and collaborating, especially for under-resourced institutions like public schools, feeling like educators and administrators can reach out to private individuals like myself who do science communication, who do science education, and that is part of our mission. It's part of our job to help make that content if you are interested in talking to your students about what the internet is and how to use it safely, knowing that you can reach outside of your institution, even to private individuals outside of, nonprofits and other things like that, to come into your classrooms, because it's part of what we love to do. And talking to kids is one of the things that makes our jobs so worthwhile and so meaningful.
Yeah.
So knowing that we're a resource, it's not ideal. It's not the way that the system should be functioning necessarily, but it is a way that we can put a Band-Aid over a problem for the moment.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Going back to our conversation of like, this is our reality, this is our context, what can we do right now with the future top of mind as well. But there are a lot of great resources, I think, that were shared on here in the chat, like from Common Sense. If you go to Common Sense website, they have a plethora of resources there. Halima put her information in the chat as well. We'll be sending out an email to all the people that registered also, just this recording. And, I wrote down like Circle of Six and some other like digital hygiene guidelines for parents of young kids. So we learned a lot, and this is just the beginning. I think it's a lot to unpack in just 1 hour. We're not going to solve, online harassment in one hour, but I love having these conversations. SAfG is hoping to build a digital literacy curriculum. We'd love to co-create that with you all and with our girls that we serve. So anyway, thank you so much for all your input and your time. This has been a really great conversation. Thank you to our participants for joining, and yeah, have a great Thursday.
Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.